New Saturday nights on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good morning and welcome to Sunday with Olivia Utley, with 2 hours of good conversation, arts and entertainment. Coming up this Easter Sunday, President Joe Biden will visit Northern Ireland in 2 days' time to mark the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Agreement. With power sharing still suspended, what is the future for the province? And the new High Commissioner of Australia says it's inevitable that his country will ditch King Charles as head of state and become a republic. Would that be the beginning of the end for the Commonwealth and indeed the monarchy? And as millions of Christians celebrate Easter, Monty Python's irreverent comedy Life of Brian goes back into cinemas. It offended many people the first time round. Have attitudes softened with age? All that, and comedian Konstantin Kissin too, after the news with Ray Addison.
Good morning. It's 1 minute past 11. Here's the latest. Patients face unparalleled levels of disruption when junior doctors start a 4-day strike on Tuesday. That's the warning from NHS National Medical Director, Professor Stephen Powis. He says he's very concerned with hospitals facing nearly 100 hours without up to half of their medical workforce. The NHS Confederation says 250,000 appointments could be postponed. Police investigating the SNP's finances have reportedly seized a luxury motorhome. According to the Mail on Sunday, the Niesman Bischoff motorhome, which can sell for around £110,000, was removed from a house in Fife. It was taken at the same time that police searched the home of Nicola Sturgeon and her husband, Peter Murrell. The leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, Douglas Ross, told us people need answers.
It's now been going on for, I think, 18 months, almost 2 years. It's been an extensive inquiry, and we saw that Peter Murrell was interviewed for almost the maximum 12 hours, released without charge, but pending further investigation, and a significant amount of evidence taken away from both their home and SNP headquarters. So I think people want answers, and those answers have to come from Nicola Sturgeon, from Hamza Yusuf, and those at the top of the SNP.
The mother of Olivia Pratt-Corbell has told the Sunday Mirror that the law should be changed to force all criminals to attend their sentencing. Cheryl Corbell has spoken out after her daughter's killer refused to appear in the dock as he was jailed for a minimum of 42 years. Justice Secretary Dominic Raab says he is planning to change the law. A new survey suggests that more than 1 in 10 teachers have been physically assaulted by a pupil in the last year. The Teachers' Union says they've been kicked, bitten and punched by pupils, whilst more than 1 in 4 have faced verbal abuse from a parent or a carer. The findings have been released during the union's annual conference in Glasgow. Today, delegates will vote on a motion which suggests that assaults are seen as a, quote, normal part of teaching in too many schools. The government is expected to crack down on the illegal sale of e-cigarettes to children with a new illicit vapes enforcement squad. The Department of Health and Social Care says task forces will carry out test purchasing at shops. It will also share intelligence with local authorities. The squads will have the power to remove illegal products from shops and at borders. Thousands of expectant mothers are set to receive a maternity allowance boost of 10.1%. The increase will see payments go up by £15.82 a week. That equates to around £617 over the 39 weeks that it can be claimed. The Department for Work and Pensions says the automatic increase will benefit around 40,000 parents this year. China's military has carried out simulated precision strikes on Taiwan, the country's state broadcaster claims. CCTV says forces continue to encircle the island as part of 3 days of military drills focused on the disputed territory. Forces have reportedly been focusing on key targets on land and in surrounding waters. Taiwan's defense ministry has also reported multiple Air Force sorties. The Prime Minister says Christian values of tolerance, compassion and charity are part of the British fabric. In his Easter message, Rishi Sunak also said that Easter Sunday gives us all a chance to reflect on the contribution that Christian communities make across the country. Mr Sunak, who is a Hindu, finished his message by wishing all those celebrating today a very happy Easter. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's get back to Sunday with Olivia Utley.
Thank you very much, Ray. While most of the UK takes a break for Easter, the political world, as always, is still busy. The anniversary of the Belfast Agreement, together with warnings from PSNI of increased terror activity, the row over the Labour Party tweet attacking Rishi Sunak on child abuse and prison sentences, queues at Dover, and that's all before the shenanigans in Scotland, with the SNP losing ground to Labour and the arrest and release of Nicola Sturgeon's husband, Peter Morrell. This week, President Biden is due to make a trip to Northern Ireland and junior doctors are taking strike action for 4 days. So, where do we start? Well, Fraser Myers is deputy editor of Spiked, and it's been a surprisingly big week for politics, I think we can agree. We're expecting quite a quiet recess. And, of course, I mean, the top story, really, is the shock arrest of Peter Morrell. Do you think this is really now the beginning of the end of the SNP? Humza Yousaf was proudly a continuity candidate for Nicola Sturgeon. Will we see some sort of change in Scotland soon?
I think it feels like the beginning of the end of that sort of regime in the SNP, that establishment, the establishment that backs Humza Yousaf, because it makes him look a bit like a dud candidate, you know, having got support from a kind of crumbling party machine. But, you know, you shouldn't underestimate the resilience of the SNP. I think they will probably lose seats, most likely to Labour. But I don't think anyone is predicting that they won't end up the largest party in Scotland at the end of the general election. So we shouldn't overplay what effect this will have on voters.
There's a theory that had all of this come out a little bit earlier, Kate Forbes would have won the leadership election. Do you think that's right? And do you think that would be better for the party?
I think that's a possibility. And yes, I think that would have been much better for the party. I mean, it's interesting, actually, considering all the backing that Humza Yousaf had. You know, he only got 52% of the vote on second preferences. Now, you know, that he should have done a lot better, really. And it was amazing that Kate Forbes, this challenger candidate, who was utterly demonised for her faith, in general for, you know, sticking it against the SNP establishment, did so well. So, yeah, maybe that could have given her a boost, because it would have discredited Humza's candidacy quite a fair bit in the eyes of a lot of people.
Thank you very much. And obviously, the SNP isn't the only story hitting the headlines this week. Keir Starmer is under fire for the tweet from Labour, a really quite shocking tweet from Labour, suggesting, implying that Rishi Sunak doesn't care whether child abusers are locked up. I mean, this seems to be a classic example of dirty tactics from Labour. Do you think it'll work?
We'll have to wait and see. I mean, it's certainly... I think the thing to point out is that it's unashamedly dirty tactics from Labour. I mean, I was speaking to Labour officials yesterday. I mean, we've seen in the papers today, they're very much doubling down. They're saying this is a campaign and a strategy that's going to continue in the run-up to the election. I think what you have to understand is, I mean, we report this today. I mean, to an extent, it's a reaction from Labour. I think Keir Starmer has reportedly been stung by... the sort of softy jibes that have been sort of fired in his direction over the last few weeks from the Tories and some of their allies. And I think it's a reaction to that. I mean, I personally think it's a misguided reaction, not because the campaign will not necessarily work on one level, but I think the problem is Keir Starmer's personal brand over the last few months and indeed years has been very much a kind of butter wouldn't melt in my mouth. I'm going to rise above the political, you know, the traditional politics. Integrity is a huge part of. Now that worked for him to an extent when he was up against Boris. I'm not entirely sure it's going to work against Rishi Sunak, and I think the contrast between how he's trying to present himself and these adverts is quite stark. And it's actually shocked quite a few people, actually, I think. Yeah.
I mean, of course, there's an argument that the very fact that we're even talking about it, it's supposed to be a shock campaign, shows that on some level it is kind of working. And I suppose Keir Starmer's, he said his mission was to clean up the Labour Party first, then show why the Conservatives aren't fit to govern, and then move on to explaining why Labour is ready. Maybe he just feels that he can sort of stop at step 2, as long as he isn't the Conservatives. That'll be enough to win him the next election.
Well, I
think
think
that's calculation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think that's the interesting point. I mean, he has got this three-pronged strategy. I mean, somebody could describe it as this sort of Operation Trident strategy, which started off reform of the Labour Party. He's had some success with that. Obviously, he's marginalised the Corbynites, or certainly marginalised Jeremy Corbyn. The second part of it is supposed to be him introducing himself to the British public. I think the polling we're seeing at the moment is indicating he's being less successful on that, and I think that is some of the background to this. We see Rishi Sunak start to move ahead of Keir Starmer in terms of preferred Prime Minister.
Do you think one issue is that it's just very difficult for sort of Keir Starmer to differentiate himself from Rishi Sunak in the personality-wise? Because, of course, with the sort of tumultuous tenures of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, he could be the safe pair of hands, the sensible technocrat who knew what he was doing. And obviously that's a bit trickier when you're up against Rishi Sunak.
I think that's right. I think that's a big factor. I think Labour obviously had a strategy for dealing with Boris Johnson. The Boris Johnson era ended. No sooner were they getting to grips with how, or working out internally how to deal with the Liz Truss era, then obviously the Liz Truss era came to a rather unfortunate and premature end.
Less said, the better.
And indeed, and they're now sort of effectively, I think you can see it, they're struggling at the moment to work out how to define themselves against Rishi Sunak and how to take on Rishi Sunak. I'm not entirely sure trying to paint Rishi Sunak as the paedophile's friend is necessarily the route to go down, but we'll see.
Fraser, there's been a lot of talk in the last few weeks about the sort of Rishi Sunak bump. Obviously, he signed off the AUKUS deal, he managed to get the Windsor framework agreed, and we have seen his personal popularity ratings go up in the polls. Do you think there is now a serious chance that the Conservatives could win the next election, or are we overplaying this bounce?
I think this is a fun thing, that sort of speculation from journalists, really. The mountain to climb in the polls is huge. But then equally, we shouldn't forget that Starmer does have a mountain to climb in terms of seats.
He's coming back from a long way.
So you could easily see a situation where he fails to get a majority or something like that. But I would not bet the house on Rishi Sunak turning it around. I mean, at the end of the day, the big issue for people is going to be the economy. And if you look at, one of Sunak's key pledges was to halve inflation. We were expecting inflation to go down about this kind of time, and it's not happening. So,
that was one of his easier...
That was one of his easier pledges that he pledged knowing that...
or believing
that that was what economists were predicting anyway. So, if inflation isn't back under control, if we don't have growth back again by the end of next year, what on earth would people be thinking? What would be the justification in people's heads to think, let's give the Tories another 5 years?
Although, I mean, that said, what Keir Starmer's 5-point strategy notably didn't include was anything about stopping the boats. And we see in opinion poll after opinion poll that this is a huge issue that the public is very, very worried about. Might that be a swaying force in the next election?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I wrote about this. I mean, I think there was a period last year where it was quite clear Keir Starmer was going to go for it, and he was actually starting to be quite bold in terms of some of the pronouncements. Something since the New Year, something's happened. I'm not entirely sure what it is. I think the proximity to power is starting to make him a little bit nervous. And I remember, Tony Blair's advisors saying they felt at times they were carrying a Ming vase across a sort of very slippery floor as they approached power. And I think you're starting to see a little bit of that. I mean, I think broadly, I'm not buying this line that, certainly on the numbers I'm seeing at the moment, that there is a prospect of Rishi Sunak turning things around to the extent that he can secure a majority. But as has been pointed out, I mean, what you've got to remember is it takes a very significant swing for Keir Starmer just to have a majority of one. Now, a majority of one's not going to be enough for him, because in those circumstances, the 20 or 30 disaffected sort of Corbynite Labour MPs suddenly hold the balance of power, and at that point they will seek to pay him back. So he needs to get a buffer if he's going to have a majority that can help him govern for at least a 5-year term.
Absolutely, and I think that question of the sort of Corbynite MPs in the Labour Party, obviously Keir Starmer has done a very good job of sort of keeping them quiet for now. But were there to be a bit of Keir Starmer's tenure to look a little bit shaky, would we see, are they really gone for good, or could that be a problem facing Starmer in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. And the Tories are going to highlight this as well, but let's not forget that Starmer was elected on a ticket of being a kind of continuity Corbynite figure. I mean,
We do forget that.
Obviously, no one should have believed that, and if you didn't see through that, that's your fault for being played. But people are going to be reminded that Keir Starmer promised to nationalise the utilities. He promised to keep free movement with the EU. He's made all kinds of different promises on Brexit, from first in 2017 saying he'd respect it, then campaigning for a second referendum, now saying he wants us to, stay out of the single market and customs union. Every issue, there is always a kind of contradictory statement that Starmer has made, and the Corbynites are going to be able to use that. But the other side of this is that the Tories need a majority because no one else is going to govern with them. So Labour could look to other parties to secure power.
Absolutely. It feels like hills for both main parties to climb. Well, thank you so much, Dan and Fraser. That was a very interesting Easter Sunday run through politics. As you will no doubt know, the deal that brought an end to 3 decades of conflict in Northern Ireland was signed on 10th of April 1998. The political deal, known as the Belfast Agreement and signed on Good Friday, was based on the idea of cooperation between communities. It helped to set up a new government for Northern Ireland, representing both nationalists and unionists. The 2 main political parties to the agreement were the Ulster Unionist Party, led by David Trimble, and the Social Democratic Party, led by John Hume, both seen here with Irish pop star Bono. The two men jointly won the 1998 Nobel Peace Prize for their work. Nearly 1,500 people died in Northern Ireland's troubles during the 20 years before the deal. Well, Dougie Beattie, GB News' Northern Ireland reporter, joins me from Stormont. Dougie, 30 years on, we're seeing tensions rising again in Northern Ireland. Is the Belfast Agreement really still doing what it was designed to do?
Well, in some terms it is, especially with cross-community things. In other terms, it's not. There's very clear terms here. In 1998, the Good Friday Agreement actually really started back in 1994. James Molyneux, the then head of the Ulster Unionist Party, and the Ulster Unionist Party was the 3rd biggest party in Westminster at that stage, never mind Northern Ireland. He retired, and there was an election between John Taylor, now Lord Kilclooney, Ken McGuinness and David Trimble, and there was a 3-way split, and David Trimble came through the middle. But he didn't, a bit like Rishi Sunak now, he didn't control the whole party totally, and instead of trying to bring those from the other side with him, those from within his own party with him, he expelled them, and they went to independents, and a lot of them went to the Democratic Unionist Party. And in the elections in 2005, John Hume could have really stepped forward and helped David Trimble, because he was, you've got to remember, 46% of Unionists voted against the Good Friday Agreement, and Trimble was in obvious electoral problems. And when he couldn't bring his party with him, well, the DUP came to power, and they were seen on the right of unionism. And of course then nationalists started voting for Sinn Féin, which would have been very much on the right of nationalism. And what happened was the SDLP's vote base collapsed, as did the Ulster Unionist parties. And those two parties then went their separate ways. And I often wonder if Lord Trimble and John Hume had have stepped aside or helped one another more, would those 2 moderate parties, even 15 years into the Good Friday Agreement, would Northern Ireland be in a different place? Because what then happened was that the Good Friday Agreement really stalled from that part forward. But in 2011 to 2013, Unionists were the most happy with the agreement, because, of course, they had their own rule. They are devolved governments. They like devolution, and they like having the steering wheel on their own policies and where they go with education and all those other things, as do the nationalists. But unfortunately it became one for you and one for me, and that's where the Good Friday Agreement really did stall. Throw into the mix the protocol after the Brexit vote, where Northern Ireland was then seen as a buffer zone between the EU and the United Kingdom, and it is now paying the cost to keep the integrity of the single market in one place. And that's why Unionists won't go into government in Northern Ireland, because of course our laws are now regarding trade and customs are all made in the EU. And of course, Unionists don't have any MEPs. There are no MEPs in Northern Ireland, but Nationalists, especially Sinn Féin, have MEPs in the Republic of Ireland. So Unionists are saying we're not going back into a government where we have no control over the very foundation of our laws. The control is including the European Courts of Justice. And the framework document in itself only really allows green lanes between the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland on retail goods that can be locked and brought straight into Northern Ireland. That is also causing problems in and around manufacturing. And with the arrival of Joe Biden coming into Northern Ireland, he's coming here, and it shows you how much disappointment there is with the Americans. This is the first time Joe Biden has appeared here as an American president. And of course, there is no Good Friday Agreement. There's nobody standing in government. And this particular security issue is going to cost the PSNI about £7 million inside Northern Ireland in the next few days.
Well, thank you very much, Dougie, for that comprehensive run-through of what's going on in Northern Ireland on this momentous anniversary. You're watching Olivia Utley on GB News, Britain's news channel. Coming up, as the UK prepares to celebrate the King's coronation, is it really inevitable that Australia will ditch the monarchy and become a republic? That's after the break.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Click that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News. The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway, Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We've got a brand new lineup every Saturday night on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today. Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight. Brand new Saturday nights on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Well, it was back in the last century that Australia held a referendum on whether or not to keep the monarchy. voters in the 1999 referendum decided they did want to keep the Queen as head of state, even though polls at the time showed overwhelming support for Australia to become a republic. The respect for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II played a huge part in the decision of many Australians. But after her death last September and the accession of King Charles, the new Australian High Commissioner, Stephen Smith, says it's now inevitable that Australia ditches the King and becomes a republic. The Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese will be attending the coronation next month. His government have decided not to have the King's face on new $5 banknotes, instead paying tribute to Indigenous culture. In a moment, we'll talk to Sarah Gould, former advisor to Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, and a former Australian MP, Tim Smith. But first, let's talk to British-Australian author Kathy Lett. So, Kathy, you're a fan of the British monarchy, as I understand it, but you don't think that they should have a role in Australia anymore?
That's right, because, Australia is actually a human minestrone. We're the most multicultural nation in the world. 1 in 3 Australians was actually born overseas. And if you talk to our new immigrants, about the royal family, they bear little allegiance to a kind of castle-encrusted, corgi-caressing gang 11,000 miles away. So I think it's inevitable that Australia will sort of come to stand on our own 2 thongs eventually, own 2 flip-flops, I should say. And it's not as though we don't appreciate Charles. He's a fascinating person. I hold him as a friend of mine. And what I love about him is, you have to do open heart surgery to know what's going on inside most upper class Englishmen. But he's a very open and passionate person. And of course, he might connect with Australian young people because of his care for the environment. They have such strong issues with conservation. And so he will reach across the divide to them in that way. But he's not really on their radar for any other reason. If you talk to most Australian young people about the Queen, they thought you were talking about Elton John. And if you talk to them about the King, they think you're talking about Elvis Presley. So, it's not as though he will resonate in any other way. But it'll be interesting to see if he can connect on environmental issues.
Isn't there an argument, though, that, if it isn't broke, don't fix it? We know that relationships between Australia and the UK are looking pretty good at the moment. The AUKUS deal has just been signed. The Commonwealth seems to be going from strength to strength. And actually, the transition from Queen Elizabeth to King Charles has been very smooth. Why do you feel, do you feel that now is the moment to make this huge change? Why not just keep our friends close?
Because there's an open wound in Australia, which goes back to 1975, when our democratically elected Prime Minister Gough Whitlam and his Labor Party was sacked by the Governor-General, who is he's the Queen's representative, the King's representative now in Australia. And of course, at the time, the monarchy said they didn't have anything to do with that decision. But now with the release of the Palace Letters, Jenny Hocking, an Australian academic, actually won a court case to get access to the Palace Letters. And we now know that the Palace did have a say in the sacking of our democratically elected government. So constitutionally, it is an issue that we can't decide our own government for ourselves. So there's that wound. Also the Harry and Meghan factor. Since the release of Harry's book, support for the monarchy has dropped. That's had a huge impact on Australians on how they view the monarchy. So there's all sorts of reasons. And also we're now nearly all of mainland Australia is now red. We are Labor. There's only one little state hanging off the bottom of Australia, Tasmania, that's still Conservative. So, and Labor Party has always been more keen for a republic than the Conservatives. So I think it's inevitable it will happen in Albanese's second term. And the only reason it failed last time, the last referendum was in 1999, was that the politicians said they would appoint the head of state. And we didn't want a grey man in the suit. Yeah. Australians wanted Kylie Minogue or Dame Edna or someone fabulous and funny to be opening buildings and cutting ribbons. So as long as we are allowed to vote for our head of state, I think it is inevitable it will happen.
Well, that's really interesting. Using the word inevitable there, that's fascinating. And thank you so much, Kathy, for that really good rundown of exactly where things stand for now. Now, I've also got with me Tim Smith, who is a former Australian MP, and Sarah Gould, who used to work for Scott Morrison. And what do you make, Tim, first, of what Kathy said there, that it's inevitable, that under Labour Australia, this is just the natural next step?
Well, firstly, Olivia, happy Easter, and thank you very much for having me on the show. Kathy is speaking on behalf of the inner woke culture of suburban Sydney, and frankly, she's completely out of touch. Firstly, with what she said about migrants. So many migrants come to Australia because they're seeking political stability. And that political stability has come from our inherited institutions from England, particularly the constitutional monarchy and our parliamentary democracy. So she's wrong about that. It's not inevitable because they literally, in 1999, the political establishment, the media, all pushed for a republic, and it was resoundingly defeated. But the most important point is this. In 123 years, 44 referenda, so to change the Australian Constitution, 44 proposals have been put and only 8 have passed. It's really hard to change the Australian Constitution, and I don't think there's any groundswell of support to remove the head of state.
Isn't there an argument that the last referendum was in 1999, the last century, a generation ago? And obviously there are some younger voters who have very different opinions from their elders. They're more sort of disconnected, perhaps, from
actually,
motherland.
this is one issue where young people are essentially going the opposite way to potentially their parents. The monarchy is actually increasing in popularity in Australia. William and Kate are unbelievably popular in Australia, and I completely disagree with what Kathy said about Harry and Meghan. They're really unpopular in Australia.
But isn't there, perhaps, Australia likes the monarchy. That looks pretty definite when you see royal visits to Australia. But maybe some of those young people, they like the idea of William and Kate, they like the English royal family, but they don't think that they still have a place in Australia. Shouldn't they get to have their say?
Well, they may well do, because it's Labor's policy that there should be an Australian republic, and Labor currently are in government federally in Australia, and they've said that they'll have a referendum in their second term. I suspect they're going to lose because, again, our system of government, very similar to Britain's, works perfectly well.
And what do you make of that, Sarah?
I also agree, particularly, and I keep reading in the media about how they were narrowly defeated in 1999, which is not the case at all. Australia, for a referendum to pass, you have to have a national majority, but also a majority in the majority of states. And they didn't get a majority in any of the states. And it's out of the 44, if you rank them, performed 35th worst. So they did not do well.
Do you think now in 2023 support for republicanism in Australia would be higher or lower than it was in 1999?
I think it fluctuates, and you see that. So just after going up to Prince William and Kate Middleton's wedding, the polls had them, I think, at the same level of support in 1991, where it was actually quite. They were quite popular then as well. So it does fluctuate over time, and it just depends what's happening here in the UK, and particularly even after the Queen's death, support for the monarchy increased again.
That's fascinating, that, because as an outsider, that's sort of what I took from it. It seemed as though the transition had gone very, very smoothly, and this sort of moment for republicanism across the world never quite took off. Would you agree with that? Is that what it felt like?
Yeah, it does.
And the other reason why it never really took off is because the Republicans can't agree on the model. See, and there's one thing I do agree with Kathy, which is there's a chunk of Republicans who desperately want to elect the president, like Ireland or France. But there's another group of Republicans, more moderate Republicans, who want to keep the Westminster system intact and therefore want the president either appointed by the Prime Minister, as is the case at the moment, where the Prime Minister essentially sends a letter to the palace and says, I want General Hurley to be the Governor-General, and that happens. They want that same system with the President or the Parliament appointing the President, keeping the Westminster system intact, i.e. the Prime Minister is the most powerful man or woman in the system. But with a directly elected President, we end up like France. And moderate Republicans don't want that.
And is that... So, Kathy, sorry, Kathy is still there? Mm-hmm. Fantastic, Kathy. What do you make of all that? I've got two fans of the monarchy sitting here saying that the Republicans just don't have their ducks in a row yet, and before that happens, there's no real chance of Australia becoming a republic.
Well, there's not going to be another referendum until Albanese's second term, which is a few years away. So there's plenty of time to get those Republican ducks in a row. And I think one of the gentlemen on the show said I was out of touch. I think that he might be slightly out of touch, because I don't think young people will bear any allegiance to, as I said, this castle-encrusted monarchy.
Well, Kathy, I'm younger than you, and I do bear great allegiance to His Majesty the King.
Cheeky.
I think one way that Charles will connect with young people, and because he's a charming man and he has a very good sense of humour. And on this idea of the monarchy, Billy Connolly told me a funny story when he was up in Aberdeenshire in his castle, and then Prince Charles came for dinner, and there was Steve Martin and Eric Idle and all these hilarious people, Ron Williams, and they were teasing Billy about living in a castle, saying, how can you be a socialist when you say you live in a castle like this? And Billy said, come the revolution, we'll all live in castles like this, to which Prince Charles said quietly, I won't.
Well, thank you very much. What a great note to end on. And thank you to my panellists there, Kathy Lett, Tim Smith and Sarah Gore. Well, the invites went out this week, and despite an RSVP deadline passing, the attendance, or not, of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex has still not been settled. The date coincides with their son Archie's birthday, and there's been increased speculation that Harry will attend alone. Whatever Harry and Meghan's decision, it will create issues with security, seating arrangements if they come, and how to keep the spotlight on the King rather than the Sussexes if they don't. Well, I'm joined here now by Rafe Hadel-Mancu, and he's a historian and royal commentator. So, Rafe, why haven't they given an answer yet? Isn't it just rude at this point?
It's absolutely rude, and this whole entire will they or won't they drama is actually getting really tedious now. And it's precisely what the King and the royal family don't need. I think, Harry and Meghan seem to be confusing the coronation with Coronation Street, but this isn't a soap opera. This is a hugely important constitutional and ceremonial event, not just for Britain and the British people, but for all of the Commonwealth realms, including Australia, as you've just been discussing. And yet Harry and Meghan, through all of this, I think, are just showing the world how childish, self-centered and, self-obsessed they are. It's actually, I think, a shameful publicity ploy by the Sussexes, and they're milking this for all that it's worth. They know that, essentially, with their distance from the royal family, they're becoming increasingly uninteresting to the public at large, increasingly irrelevant. This is a way to keep them onto the headlines, onto the front pages, and actually it makes them seem to be powerful with the royal family, seemingly trying to entice them over the pond. But as you say, this is really quite narcissistic, because at the end of the day, this is about celebrating the King. All attention must be on the monarchy and on the King, creating a good vibe in these last few weeks before the coronation. We must create the most positive atmosphere.
On the subject of the King, do you think he actually wants them to come? Of course, he's talked about loving his son Harry unconditionally, but is there a danger that they become the focus? It becomes a sort of Harry and Meghan show?
Well, the view from the palace seems to be that having them not attend is worse than actually having them attend. Now, opinions may differ on that and whether it's right or not, but certainly there's no precedent for the son of a king not attending his father's coronation. We've had King Edward VII didn't attend, King Edward VIII rather didn't attend his brother's coronation, but that was a different matter entirely. And I think the king wants to basically be seen to be always open, waiting for his prodigal son. He is the head of the Church of England, and what could be more Christian than to always have a door open to welcome home your prodigal son? But this really does just deflect so much from what should be an occasion for building national unity, building a sense of social cohesion through street parties and so forth. And yet, rather than focusing on what it means to be British and the monarchy and the important role of the coronation in our constitution, we're instead being distracted by these tedious sort of tittle-tattle stories that we see in the media.
Not meaning to engage too much in the tittle-tattle, but how do you think Prince William would feel about it if Prince Harry did turn up?
Well, of course, we know that any hope of a reconciliation between the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Sussex is so far beyond the horizon. We couldn't even imagine a scenario right now where that could possibly happen. He's very worried, of course, that any private engagements that Prince Harry would attend would end up being discussed on a future American talk show or in a sequel to Spare. We have to remember that.
As we saw with
Prince
the
Harry
interviews,
has threatened to have another one. We know that Meghan is also keeping a diary. And so there's a great deal of concern that Harry and Meghan, or Harry if he attends alone, will just try to spin this in some way to advance their own agenda.
Absolutely. It's quite a tricky situation. Do you think perhaps that there is disagreement between King Charles and his son William on whether to have Harry attend? I mean, it sounds from what you're saying there that William might rather he wasn't there, and perhaps the King would rather he was there because, as you say, it shows him as the magnanimous father welcoming back the prodigal son. Do you think there is a bit of a tension there?
Well, there absolutely was, certainly over the past few months, if not the past couple of years, between the two. I think the fact that, you know, Prince Harry publicly attacked Queen Camilla in Spare perhaps brought William and the King closer together in terms of their view of the likelihood of ever reconciling with the Sussexes. But I wouldn't say that you're wrong there. That Prince William is far more averse to that idea than the King is.
Well, thank you very much, Rafe. That was really, really interesting. It'll be fascinating to see what happens, whether we get an answer in the next week. Well, you're watching Olivia Utley on GB News, Britain's news channel. Coming up, it caused a controversy when it first came out. In fact, it was even banned in Harrogate. More than 40 years on, Monty Python's Life of Brian film is back in cinemas this week, even in Harrogate. But that's all after the break.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Welcome back. It was controversial, irreverent, and banned in Harrogate. Monty Python's Life of Brian, a film about an ordinary man who is mistaken for the Messiah in Judah, was released just over 40 years ago. The film is now back in cinemas, even in Harrogate, for a limited run. Contentious then, is it still one of the greatest comedies ever, or is it just offensive?
Now you listen here. He's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy. What have the Romans ever done for us?
Judean People's Front. Well, the People's Front of Judea.
And thank you for joining me here, Stefan. You're the arts editor of The Express Online. Now, what do you make of re-releasing Life of Brian? Is it worth it?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I rewatched it just for this, and thank you for the excuse. Yeah, 100%. It's as funny today as it was then. It's also terrifyingly relevant again in many of the themes. So they were very much ahead of their time, but at the same time, it's proving that nothing ever changes.
Do you think it's going to be less controversial this time round? We're a less religious society than we were 40 years ago, or will those groups who were so angry about it then feel just the same today?
There's always going to be a hoo-ha. People are always going to protest something, and let's not show it in great swathes of the United States at the moment, where the religious right has gone incredibly extreme again, and all of that ties in with what's happening in the film. No, there's no real room for protest now. Back in 1979, it was the end of religion as a very much part of the fabric of our society, and that was changing then. It has changed now. But even since then, a lot of religious organisations have shown the film, with some controversy amongst them. But yeah, it's.
Do you think that maybe takes a bit of the fun out of it? Was part of the joy of Life of Brian when it was first released that there was a bit of a taboo over it, that it was so controversial?
Absolutely, of course. We like doing something that's a bit forbidden and a bit naughty. It had lots of X ratings by some UK councils and things like that. Sure, but number one, it's still really funny. And
good reason as any.
I was really surprised at how smart it is, how many good points there are about. It's being funny in the way of all the best satires, but it's telling you fundamentally, ultimately, think for yourself. Don't follow other people. Don't listen to dogma. You can apply that to politics, to religion, to anything, to social media. It's all happening now again.
Absolutely. I mean, you say it wouldn't be shown in large parts of America now. What about Harrogate? Why was it so controversial?
There were lots of provincial councils that were outraged by it, but also it was a very brief moment, and then it was quickly unbanned. It just became a bit of a myth. But it was for a long time. Places like Italy, Norway banned it. So Swedish posters said, "So funny, it's banned in Norway." Italy and Ireland, obviously much more religious societies. Yeah. But yeah, I think probably a bit like Frankie Goes to Hollywood or anything like that in those days. It was probably a good story as well.
And a very, very different tone. A Little Life is coming to the West End now, starring James Norton. Now, I read the book and found it unbelievably depressing. How does it translate to the stage?
It's a very, very hard watch. I'm very glad I saw it. I was riveted while I was watching it, and I didn't want to look away. And I don't often like being shown themes. I mean, if we're going to talk about it, the theme is about a man that has been repeatedly sexually abused as a child. He's also raped as an adult. He has intense physical and psychological problems. He self-harms all through his life. It's a very, very, very heavy subject matter, and it's a hard watch, and it is all absolutely presented for you across 4 hours on stage.
You gave it 4 stars, I
did.
think. Why did it not get the full 5?
I personally, the same as the book, I absolutely hate the ending. I feel that there's always been this backlash since the book came out when it was hugely popular. There's a revision now. People are very uneasy whether this is torture porn, whether we are voyeurs to watching someone suffering. And I normally hate anything like that. I don't watch programmes or anything about this, but I felt compelled to watch here. And his suffering and misery is unimaginable. And there's just one final blow late in life that for me, actually felt like a plot device. It felt cliched and it felt unnecessary. I don't think it needed it. And it absolutely floored me. I was annoyed and distressed and frustrated. So I don't know whether that's just my own emotional response to it, but I absolutely could not get on board with the ending.
What did you make of James Norton in the main role? I mean, James Norton seems to have been jumping around all sorts of different parts. Of course, famously in Happy Valley recently as the archetypal villain, playing a very different character here. What did you make of him?
He's extraordinary, incredible. It's a towering performance. He's mesmerising. He's absolutely gorgeous. But also, he's got that film star presence and quality. But he's also an incredibly nuanced, subtle actor. And he's naked constantly in the play, physically, emotionally as well. This is a brave performance. I could not take my eyes off him. This is someone that's doing this on some days twice a day on matinee days. I don't know how anybody can do this, but he's phenomenal. This is absolutely establishing him as one of our greatest actors.
Absolutely. I mean, it must be really physically draining, and it must take its mental toll as well. I remember the part of Jude, and it really is truly harrowing. Do you think that's going to be difficult for him to sort of shake it off? He talked about when he was in Happy Valley, struggling to sort of shake his character off as he went to bed.
This one, I cannot imagine. This is 4 hours and then some days 8 hours, and they stay on stage in the interval as well. So I guess that's probably even easier just to stay in it. I have no idea how someone processes all of that, because when he is doing it, he's often playing himself as the child, reliving what happened to him. And it's so utterly believable. He is so completely in the role. So I think phenomenal in terms of that. Phenomenal. The audience response to him has been incredible.
I think you mentioned in your review, talking of the audience taking photographs of him on stage.
Yes. Not the audience, absolutely not the audience, but definitely unforgivably somebody. And I don't know whether it was an audience member that then saw an opportunity and circulated them or sold them on, or whether it was something to do with the press. I don't know. Yes, he's naked a lot. He runs around naked. He's on a table naked, and there are 3 rows of audience on the stage, so they're very close to him. He's very exposed in every sense of the word, and it's an absolute violation that someone took pictures when someone is giving all of themselves like this. And nudity in itself is art. It can be art, absolutely. But in this context, it was voyeuristic, it was a violation, it was unacceptable, and has very, very uncomfortable parallels with what is happening to the character and the violation of their own self in the play. So it was very, very distressing that happened.
Absolutely, really distressing. Is there any sort of penalty for people who do that?
To my knowledge, no. I mean, you can ban, there's a lot of bad behaviour happening at the moment in theatres, and people can be banned by a theatre, but that's almost impossible to enforce, and I don't even know if they knew where the photos had come from, unless, I don't know if it started on a social media account. But there's very little you can do, unless there's discussion at the moment about whether, when I go to see film screenings, they often used to take away our phones. Now we have to put them in sealed plastic bags. There are conversations about that. Should that start happening in theatres? I'm fairly on board with that.
Gosh, yeah, I mean, I think we probably are at the stage where something like that needs to happen when someone, an actor like that, puts himself out there, as you say. So where and when can we see A Little Life? And would you ultimately recommend it?
Very hard to answer. It's on at the Harold Pinter Theatre at the moment, and then it's transferring to the Savoy, so it's on for a couple more months. It's selling incredibly well. I don't know how many people are going for the star power and how many truly know what it's about, but I think it's important. It should be seen. I'm very glad I've seen it. To recommend it, I would case by case with people. There's some friends I wouldn't recommend, others yes. But we need plays like this, and the production itself is stunning, whatever you think of the content. So yes, but that for once is what art is. That's what art is about for once. Even I am still thinking, and I'm not quite sure, and we need more of that.
Well, thank you very much, Stefan. I think I'll be going to see it as an advert for me. Well, to the weather now, thank you.
Hello there, and a very happy Easter to you. I'm Jonathan Vautry here with your latest weather update from the Met Office. After a relatively fine Easter weekend so far, there are a few changes as we head into the second half, and high pressure is still mainly in charge across Scotland, England and Wales, but we've got these frontal features out in the Atlantic that are gradually pushing their way in from the west. So particularly as we head throughout this afternoon across Northern Ireland, we could see some outbreaks of rain here, but for everyone else it will generally stay dry throughout the day with some hazy sunshine. A bit more cloud perhaps lingering across eastern coastal areas, particularly eastern Scotland and up into Shetland, where it could stay relatively cloudy throughout the day. Otherwise, though, temperatures above average for the time of year, reaching highs of 17, perhaps 18 degrees Celsius in a few spots, thanks to these southerly winds that are coming up. But those winds will turn quite brisk overnight, particularly for Northern Ireland and around coast of Scotland as the rain pushes in. And we could see some heavier bursts of rain across western areas this evening. Generally for Wales, central southern areas of England, the rain will turn patchier as it moves eastwards, and underneath all that cloud tonight, temperatures will be holding up quite significantly compared to where we have seen around 9-10 degrees Celsius. A bit cooler for Northern Ireland, Western Scotland first thing in the morning underneath those clearer spells, but there'll be some showers pushing their way in later on as well, and these showers could certainly be heavy for a time. The rain will take its time to clear off the far southeast, but we will see some sunny spells developing here later on, and the showers will also persist into the afternoon. And again, risk of some hail, thunder in the mixture as well. Temperatures down tomorrow compared to where we'll see them on Sunday, but more around average for the time of year. Showers persisting into the evening as well, and it sets us up for a pretty unsettled week to come. Particularly Tuesday evening into the start of Wednesday is looking very windy for a lot of us, with the risk of some disruptive winds at times. So do stay up to date with the full forecasts over the next few days. Temperatures also just continuing to slide down ever so slightly.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island's story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon and welcome back to Sunday with Olivia Utley. More good conversation, arts and entertainment. Coming up, we believe in democracy but distrust our politicians. The results of a new study show we trust our politicians about as much as the people in both Russia and Nigeria do. An immigrant's love letter to the West, what Russian-Britain comedian Konstantin Kisin feels about life in the UK. And Michael Portillo and world-renowned cellist Julian Lloyd-Webber explore what is classical music. That's all after the news with Ray Addison.
Thanks, Olivia. 2 minutes past 12, here's the latest. Patients face unparalleled levels of disruption when junior doctors start a 4-day strike on Tuesday. That's the warning from NHS National Medical Director, Professor Stephen Powis. He says he's very concerned with hospitals facing nearly 100 hours without up to half of their medical workforce. The NHS Confederation says 250,000 appointments could be postponed. Police investigating the SNP's finances have reportedly seized a luxury motorhome. According to the Mail on Sunday, the Niesman Bischoff camper, which can sell for around £110,000, was removed from a house in Fife. It was taken at the same time that police searched the home of Nicola Sturgeon and her husband, Peter Morell. The leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, Douglas Ross, told us the people need answers.
It's now been going on for, I think, 18 months, almost 2 years. It's been an extensive inquiry, and we saw that Peter Morel was interviewed for almost the maximum 12 hours, released without charge, but pending further investigation, and a significant amount of evidence taken away from both their home and SNP headquarters. So I think people want answers, and those answers have to come from Nicola Sturgeon, from Hamza Yusuf, and those at the top of the SNP.
The mother of Olivia Pratt-Corbell has told the Sunday Mirror the law should be changed to force all criminals to attend their sentencing. Cheryl Corbell has spoken out after her daughter's killer refused to appear in the dock as he was jailed for a minimum of 42 years. Justice Secretary Dominic Raab says he's planning to change the law. A new survey suggests more than 1 in 10 teachers have been physically assaulted by a pupil in the last year. The Teachers' Union says they've been kicked, bitten and punched by pupils, whilst more than 1 in 4 have faced verbal abuse from a parent or a guardian. The findings have been released during the union's annual conference in Glasgow. Today, delegates will vote on a motion which suggests that assaults are now seen as a normal part of teaching in too many schools. The government is expected to crack down on the illegal sale of e-cigarettes to children with a new illicit vapes enforcement squad. The Department of Health and Social Care says task forces will carry out test purchasing at some shops. It will also share intelligence with local authorities. The squads will have the power to remove illegal products and from shops and in borders. Thousands of expectant mothers are set to receive a maternity allowance boost of 10.1%. The increase will see payments go up by £15.82 a week. That equates to around £617 over the 39 weeks that it can be claimed. The Department for Work and Pensions says the automatic increase will benefit around 40,000 parents this year alone. China's military has carried out simulated precision strikes on Taiwan, the country's state broadcaster has claimed. CCTV says forces continue to encircle the island as part of 3 days of military drills focused on the disputed territory. Forces have reportedly been focusing on key targets on land and in surrounding waters. Taiwan's defence ministry has also reported multiple Air Force sorties. Well, the Prime Minister says Christian values of tolerance, compassion and charity are all part of the British fabric. In his Easter message, Rishi Sunak said that Easter Sunday gives us all a chance to reflect on the contribution that Christian communities make across the country. Mr Sunak, who is a Hindu, finished his message by wishing all those celebrating today a very happy Easter. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. So let's get back to Sunday with Olivia Utley.
Thanks very much, Ray. Well, we British are a complicated lot. A new survey shows few people in the UK think politics is working for them, but we still staunchly support democracy. The research by the Policy Institute at King's College London was part of the World Values Survey, one of the largest and most widely used academic social surveys in the world. Just 17% of people in the UK say they are highly satisfied with how the political system is functioning. That figure is among the lowest of the 23 countries in the survey, and on par with Russia, Mexico and Nigeria. But the UK does come higher than France and the US. Among UK nations, Northern Ireland is by far the least satisfied with how its political system is functioning, at just 7%. Despite the dissatisfaction with politics, though, 90% of people questioned believe democracy is a good way to govern the country, with increased support coming from millennials. The results of the survey come weeks before local elections in England and Northern Ireland. Well, the director of the Policy Institute at King's College London, which carried out the research, is Professor Bobby Duffy, and he joins me now. Thank you, Professor Duffy. So, Professor Duffy, what is this crisis in democracy at the moment? Is that what we would call it, or is it simply frustration with how the current politicians are running the country now?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right question, Olivia. I think what this study shows is that it's more how democracy is being delivered and how the political system is working for people that people have an issue with, not the principle of democracy itself. And that's really important distinction to make, because we have seen some commentary that suggests that people have fallen out of love with democracy and are more open to authoritarian forms of ruling countries. But this shows that actually we've seen an increase in support for the idea of democracy. People, it's now 9 in 10 people thinking that democracy is a very good way to run a country. And that's gone up from about 3/4 of people saying that in the 1990s. So it's not so much the principle of it, and it's not people flirting with different types of rule. It is the fact that it's not working for people. It's their own direct experience of how things are going, influencing their views of this current encapsulation of the political system, not the principle.
Say that they don't feel that politics is working for them. What do you think they mean by that? Do you think it's that the voting system doesn't work, or is it more that they don't feel that politicians are representing their interests in Parliament?
I think it's a lot about delivery, how people's lives are going, because the actual views of whether elections are working, that's also asked in the study, and people are pretty confident in how elections are working in places like the UK. So it's more delivery. We released another package of data from this a couple of weeks ago, and that showed that confidence in key political institutions has declined hugely in the past couple of decades. So we've seen actually a half in confidence in key things like Parliament. That has gone from half of people saying that they have a high level of confidence in Parliament to just 1/4 of people saying they have a high level of confidence in Parliament in 2022. And the same pattern goes for things like government and political parties. So it's much more about that lack of trust in the current versions of what we've got, rather than the underlying idea.
Do you think that's about the calibre of MPs? Because that's something that people talk about quite a lot. Or is that kind of nostalgic? Is it people who think, yes, things were always better back in the day? We had grand titans of politicians back in the day, and now they're all pygmies. Or is that a genuine concern, which is frustrating people about the way Parliament is run today?
So again, a really good point to make is that we do tend to think the past was better than it was. We've got this rosy retrospection where we think everything is going downhill because we forget the bad parts of the past. But that's why these studies that take a very long-term view and measure the same questions over a long period of time are really useful in understanding what's really changed. If you ask people, was it better in the old days? They would more than likely say yes, but these track those perceptions over time, so it gives you a much truer understanding of what's really changing. And I think it's not hard to look at events that have happened, political events that have happened that could undermine people's confidence. We've had a lot of scandals, we've had a lot of trouble in Parliament, getting Parliament to agree on approaches to Brexit, and then lots of fractious debates in Parliament, as well as relatively high-profile scandals over recent years. So you can understand why that type of news focus is going to undermine people's confidence.
Thank you very much, Bobby. We're very nearly out of time, but just quickly, you say that there's a problem with both government and with Parliament in general. Do you think a change of government would fix this problem, or is it more deeply entrenched than that?
Yeah, it's another great question. It's these are long-term trends that have seen a gradual decline over time. So there is a kind of tidal movement towards that lower level of trust. But what we also do see in the data over this length of period is that it does go up and down. So delivery does matter, and changes in government do affect people's perception. So it's definitely not all lost for the system overall. And we've got to hold on to that fact that trust and confidence in the principle of democracy and how it works in this country is still high and rising.
Well, thank you very much, Bobby, and very nice to end with a positive note this Easter Sunday. Now, popular wisdom says write about what you know, and Russian-British comedian Konstantin Kisin has done just that. His book, An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, reflects on his path as a Soviet immigrant to the UK, the opportunities he's found, and how he's embraced his chosen home country. The book has just been published in paperback, and Konstantin sat down with GB News political editor Tom Harwood.
Konstantin Kisin, a comedian, a journalist, a commentator as well, someone who's very thoughtful on a number of issues. Why did you decide to write a book entitled An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West?
Someone should. That's how I felt. I felt someone should write a book about that because no one else is going to. You know, you see the sort of thing that is rewarded now in our societies. You know, the more time you spend talking it down, talking about how evil it was 500 years ago and whatever, the more rewarded you are for that. And I really wasn't that interested in having that conversation from that angle because I first of all, I think it's been done to death at this point, but also I think it needs a challenge. It needs balancing out that narrative about this country or the West more broadly. I don't think represents the reality of where we are. I think if we're objective about it, we have to admit that we live in one of the best places in not just in the world today, but in the entire history of the human species.
I'm interested in your background because, of course, you come from one of these countries originally where they had to put up walls to stop people from leaving. Whereas in the West, there's a lot of contention about people putting up walls and barriers to stop people coming in. It seems like there's a big distinction there between the sort of societies that people try and escape from and those people risk their lives to get towards. Can you tell us a bit about your childhood?
You put your finger on a very interesting conundrum, didn't you? Because we're constantly told that we live in this deeply racist society, and yet people who are black and brown are desperate to get here. There's something off about that, it seems to me. But in terms of my background, I was born in the late Soviet Union.
In the book, you talk a bit about your grandparents as well. Your grandfather, who was essentially forced out of any jobs for expressing an opinion. Your grandmother, who was in a gulag. Can you speak to that?
She was born in a gulag. She lives in Bristol. You can go and talk to her. She's alive today. So that's why I feel like our memories have become very short and very geographically limited too. We sort of forget about a world that existed only a blink ago. And my grandmother was born in a gulag because both her parents, who were not together at the time, they'd been sent there for various, crimes of various kinds, of saying the wrong thing, being from the wrong background, whatever. And they met there. Actually, my grandmother's mother ended up in the gulag because her husband had been taken away, and she went to inquire after him. And they were, oh, you're here, great, let's put you in the camp. With that sort of family background, I have something to compare the terrible, evil West to, and it doesn't seem quite as bad to me.
You do draw on some potential broader comparisons, perhaps not going as far as to say that we're going down a road to serfdom, but potentially taking some backward steps.
I don't think we're going to get to the gulag side of things, but I do think we are replicating some of the things that we saw in the Soviet Union when it comes to things like policing of people's thoughts, policing of people's speech. Most people in the West have no idea where political correctness comes from, but actually it was invented in the Soviet Union, later adopted by Maoists in China. And the point of political correctness was never to protect people's feelings, to make sure that minorities weren't offended or whatever we think of as now. The point of political correctness was to say, well, what you're saying, Tom, may be true, but it is not convenient to the party line, and therefore you must keep quiet. So we're definitely not going to the gulags, but on the other hand, we are spending an inordinate amount of time trying to control what other people think and say. And, I think one of the great triumphs of the West is creating a culture in which people are relatively free to express themselves. And that feeds into the science, the technology that we are able to create because we're able to experiment, to play with things, to play with ideas. So I think people who are paying attention and people who understand history ought to be very, very worried and concerned.
I wonder, to what extent do you think we are going down this path irreversibly, and what could be done to put us back on that road to a freer society?
That's a really good question, Tom. As you know, I put a bunch of ways of destroying the West. But the one that I feel most strongly about is the last one, where I talk about how all of us have a duty not to be a useful idiot. This is a term that Lenin came up with to describe people in the West who could be persuaded to go along with supporting what the communists were doing in Russia and later the Soviet Union. And I think that's really the biggest difficulty that we have. Too many of us have been unwilling to stand up and say, actually, no, I don't support this. Actually, no, I'm not going along with this. Too many of us have accepted that in order to look good or to not be fired from our workplaces or not to be offensive to anyone, we must go along with things that actually deep down we know are wrong. Look at the grooming gang situation, covered up for decades, people unwilling to confront difficult issues, not because they didn't know right from wrong, but because they were worried about the racial sensitivities and whatever. We've got to, if we want to have a healthy multi-ethnic society, which is, I hope, what we have, we got to be able to talk about all of these things. So we got to all stop pretending to not know what we know and not to believe what we believe.
Why does it take a comedian to write this book?
Well, I certainly wouldn't want to pretend that I'm the only person who's been speaking up about these issues. All the people that do end up being called names and they're bigots and racist and xenophobes, which kind of explains why few people want to get involved in it. I felt that I had the duty, not only as someone who's a social commentator, but also, you know, it's called an immigrant's love letter to the West. And unfortunately, that is the shield that you now have to be able to talk about these issues. You've got to go, well, look, I'm obviously not racist, but here's some points. I wish we got to a position where people who look like you and people who look like me and people who look like every other skin color could say what they have to say without people instantly trying to destroy their lives and call them names. I think we should be able to have a sensible discussion about many of these issues, particularly when, you know, it's not like I've written a book that sort of champions something evil. I'm just saying what we have here is quite good. The fact that people might be concerned about writing a book like that, I think, tells you quite a lot about where we are as a society.
Why is, well, finally, in this conversation, the book is, of course, titled An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. You've mentioned that this is a bit of an homage to another book that was written, or another paper that was written not so long ago.
Yeah, Yuri Bezmenov, who I really recommend people go and find online. He wrote a book called A Love Letter to America. And he was making many of the same warnings. Thankfully, many of the warnings that the predictions that he made didn't quite come to fruition. We've got to remember who we are. And the problem I have with the direction of travel we have in the West is we are starting to forget that for all our faults, we actually have some pretty good things here that are worth standing up for, that are worth defending, and that, by the way, stand up to scrutiny. They stand up to what the Russian government might say about us, to what the Chinese government might say about us. We have things that are worth protecting, that are worth sharing with the rest of the world. And the reason we started this conversation with the idea that many, many people around the world want to come here pretty much makes that point. So the most important thing is when people attack us, they attack our values, we say, no, we're not the worst people that have ever lived. We're actually quite good. And we believe in our values, that we believe that they're good for us. We believe that they're good for other people who want to be like us. And we're going to support them with that. And we're going to be confident in ourselves.
Konstantin Kisin, thank you.
Thanks very much for having me.
And thank you to Konstantin Kisin and Tom Harwood there. You're watching Olivia Utley on GB News, Britain's news channel. Coming up, it's been 70 years since the little-known writer called Ian Fleming published his first book. Casino Royale introduced James Bond to the world, and the rest, as they say, is history. That's after the break.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes & Co.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Click that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions are, those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes & Co. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We've got a brand new lineup every Saturday night on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight. Brand new Saturday nights on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. It was designed to be the first in a series of stories featuring a suave and super competent British spy. But author Ian Fleming could not have seen just how successful his character would become. Casino Royale, the first book to feature 007 James Bond, was published 70 years ago on April the 13th, 1953. The Bond books have now sold 7 billion copies worldwide and spawned a movie franchise worth £6 billion. In 2019, a first edition of Casino Royale sold for just over £55,000 at auction, far more than the original price of 10 shillings and sixpence, or about 56 pence in today's money. Professor Jeremy Black is the author of The World of James Bond, The Lives and Times of 007, and he joins me now. So, hello. Professor Black, can you talk to me a bit about why James Bond has this enduring popularity over so many decades? What is it about this character?
Well, Fleming was a great novelist, and also James Bond transferred extremely well to the screen, and on the screen became a real global product. As a character in fiction, he was largely sort of Britain and the United States. John Kennedy was very fond of the Bond stories, for example, and had Fleming to stay in the White House. But it's really after Dr. No in 1962, and more particularly after Goldfinger, and Goldfinger was a great hit in West Germany, in France, in Italy, in Japan, that James Bond becomes global. And it's been reckoned for about 15 to 20 years now that he's been seen by more than half the world's population.
That's quite a record, isn't it? For this new generation, the people in their late teens and early 20s now, they're quite sort of puritanical in their outlook. They don't really drink. They don't seem to be particularly interested in the kind of womanising pursuits that James Bond gets up to. Do you think that James Bond's popularity might now be on the wane, or is there something in the Bond franchise for the next generation too?
Well, I made the point in my book that you already see change in the films from the 1990s. You have a female M with Judi Dench. You have Bond becomes a serial monogamist, so each film he only has one girlfriend, and in fact the sex becomes much less prominent. He doesn't drink very much, doesn't smoke anymore. The only thing he does, which is not PC, is kill a lot of people.
And how do you think that I've heard hardcore James Bond fans say that they feel that some of the latest films have actually hollowed out Ian Fleming's work, and the Bond that we see now, the sort of PC, lovely to women, not much of a drinker Bond, just isn't at all the character that Ian Fleming wrote about. Do you think that division has become too stark now?
Well, it's certainly a change, but it's worth bearing in mind that you would have had to alter James Bond anyway, because James Bond, when they came out, both as the novels and as the first films, was for an Anglophone world. The world's leading film market in '62 was America. The second leading film market was the UK. Now, most of the people that watch the films don't have English as their first language, and they're much more adventure sequences, a lot more fighting, a lot more chases, designed in some respects to, as it were, compete with the Bourne Identity films, and designed to appeal to people who, as the Japanese call him, Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang.
We don't have much longer left, Jeremy, but can I just ask you quickly, who's your favourite Bond?
Oh, without a doubt, Sean Connery. You could believe him killing somebody up close. You could believe that of Daniel Craig, but you've got to think this character could break your neck in a fight as opposed to just shoot you from a distance.
Quite right, I'm with you there. Thanks very much to Jeremy Black. Coming up, from Bach to Beethoven, Michael Portillo and world-famous cellist Julian Lloyd-Webber explore what is classical music. That's after the news with Ray Addison.
Good afternoon, it's 12:30, here's the latest. Patients face unparalleled levels of disruption when junior doctors start a 4-day strike on Tuesday. That's the warning from NHS National Medical Director, Professor Stephen Powis. He says he's very concerned with hospitals facing nearly 100 hours without up to half of their medical workforce. The NHS Confederation says 250,000 appointments could be postponed. Police investigating the SNP's finances have reportedly seized a luxury motorhome. According to the Mail on Sunday, the Niesman Bischoff camper, which can sell for around £110,000, was removed from a house in Fife. It was taken at the same time that police searched the home of Nicola Sturgeon and her husband, Peter Morell. China's military has carried out simulated precision strikes on Taiwan, the country's state broadcaster claims. CCTV says forces continue to encircle the island as part of 3 days of military drills focused on the disputed territory. Forces have reportedly been focusing on key targets on land and in surrounding waters. A new survey suggests that more than 1 in 10 teachers have been physically assaulted by a pupil in the last year. The Teachers' Union says they've been kicked, bitten and punched by pupils, whilst more than 1 in 4 have faced verbal abuse from a parent or carer. Today, delegates at the union's annual conference will vote on whether assaults are now seen as a, quote, normal part of teaching in schools. The government is expected to crack down on the illegal sale of e-cigarettes to children with a new illicit vapes enforcement squad. The Department of Health and Social Care saying that task forces will carry out test purchasing at various shops. They'll also share intelligence with local authorities. We're on TV, online, on DAB Plus radio, and of course we're on TuneIn too. This is GB News. Back now to Olivia.
Thank you, Ray. Coming up, classical music legend and friend of the programme, Julian Lloyd-Webber and Michael Portillo will take us on a journey through 8 centuries to discover what is classical music. That's after the break.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything, I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Welcome back. The popularity of classical music has never been greater. Statistics from last year show the hours of classical music streamed on YouTube were up 90% on the year before. But what is classical music? Renowned cellist and friend of the programme, Julian Lloyd-Webber, went with Michael Portillo to the Portillo School for Young Musicians, Britain's oldest music school, to find out the answer.
Julian, you've really surprised me, because to begin with, you're going to talk about a person from the 12th century and a woman. Two big surprises.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, you know, that people talk about classical music, but they don't necessarily realise how long a period of time we're talking about, and all these composers are so different. Interestingly, with this lady, Hildegard von Bingen, we know a lot about her. She was an extraordinary polymath figure. She wrote treatises on medicine and even became a saint. They called her a saint.
And how do you know that what she was writing in the 12th century is classical music? What kind of definition are you using?
This is the whole basic question. What is classical music? At the time, a lot of what we call classical music from that period came out of the church. We know it's classical music as soon as we hear it. There's no other real possible definition for it.
What sort of instruments was she able to compose for? Were the instruments very different in those days?
Mostly, she composed for voices. And in fact, this string quartet is a piece that was originally for voices.
Music written for the church, for the human voice, by a saint. And you could almost hear it there soaring through a Norman abbey, couldn't you?
Yeah, it's very meditative, isn't it? It's extraordinary.
Now we're going to make quite a jump centuries-wise, a good 400 years to Vivaldi.
They called him the Red Priest because he had very ginger, striking hair, apparently, and was usually hidden under a white wig, so we don't really have many paintings of that. But he was called the Red Priest, and he was quite a fiery character too. Quite out of fashion for a time. While he was alive, he was very well known. His music went out of fashion, and some composers have been quite rude about it. Stravinsky said he didn't write 400 concertos, he wrote the same concerto 400 times.
And this piece illustrates the 4 seasons of the year. Now, do you think that his soundscape succeeds in conveying to us those 4 seasons?
I think he really did. When you think he's just working with a string orchestra, each movement says the time of the year, and this has to be spring.
Sounded to me like some of the bird song of spring.
At the end there's little birds chirping away.
Julian, one of your least surprising choices is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and I suppose a lot of people think they know about him because some of his music is so popular and they've seen movies about Mozart. But for you, what is the greatness of Mozart?
It's really hard to describe it. I think he was a total genius. And I read a lovely quote from him that he said, "I choose the notes that love each other." And that's a wonderful quote. And when you hear his music, it sounds exactly right.
And although he died in his 30s, there was an enormous amount of work produced in that period. And of course, it covered a whole range of different sorts of music.
He wrote so much music and he lived for his music.
Why is he an important moment in music?
Well, all his successors have pointed to Mozart as being, a massive influence.
Did you get a particular pleasure with your cello playing Mozart?
Well, this is the one mistake he made in his life, or at least the one mistake I feel he made. He never wrote a cello concerto. He never wrote for cello, which is extremely irritating. But I then got to conduct some of his music, which was wonderful, because I never really had the chance to play Mozart before.
So to represent Mozart, you could have chosen operas, symphonies, of course, any number of concertos.
Yeah.
In fact, you've chosen one of the best-known pieces, most popular pieces.
Yes.
A little night music, eine kleine Nachtmusik. Why so?
Everyone knows this, and this is really sort of quintessential Mozart. This is his style, and as he said, he chose the notes that he loves.
So very popular, so very familiar, almost hackneyed, but you can still hear the brilliance there, can you?
But it's so simple, and yet it's genius.
Julian, I suppose on any list of classical music there would be Ludwig van Beethoven, because here was a man whose work apparently can be divided roughly into 3 phases.
There were no rules for him. He completely rewrote any rules that there might be. And so he just took classical music or music to a different dimension.
This poor man was going deaf from quite an early age. And war was raging throughout Europe, and he was very aware of the politics of Europe. Say something about the strains that must have been upon him.
Composers are sensitive to what's happening, and it very much affected his writing. I think that you're going to hear that with the start of Beethoven 5. And I think his deafness was, it was a tragedy for a musician. And in some of the later works, you hear him put these low trills down. It's going down the bottom of the bed, and they're going on and on and on under the music. And people are saying, was that actually his tinnitus?
So the first piece we're going to hear from Beethoven is Opus 18. Julian, you've given up your position at the piano to younger talent, which we're going to hear in just a moment. We're still with Beethoven, but now we're on to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And it seems to me that this piece of music almost stands on its own, as they would put it on a pedestal. If you asked a person to name a single piece of classical music, I bet they might well name Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Why so, do you think?
It's extraordinary. I mean, you just hear this beginning. Nobody ever written a piece of music like that before. So it's a one-off.
We move on from Beethoven to Tchaikovsky, and this seems to me a very important geographical change.
Yes.
Because most of the music we've heard so far has been from what I would call Western Europe, Southern Europe, but anyway, Catholic Europe, Protestant Europe. Now suddenly we go to Orthodox Europe. This Russian who had such an influence on music everywhere.
Yes, I mean, I actually get irritated with the phrase Western classical music because so much of the music I love comes from Russia, and I never thought that that was categorized as the West, and it almost seems political to me.
I rather think of Tchaikovsky in two parts. Some of those symphonies that absolutely tear at your heart, the most emotional and tragic music. And then some of those marvellous ballet steps, that simplest of tunes that stick in your mind forever.
But he was a fantastic melodist, wasn't he? I mean, he really could write a tune, as we're going to hear. I think it's fascinating going from this Beethoven 5 to Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet, because Beethoven really showed that he tore up the rule book and paved the way for Tchaikovsky to be able to write something which is so completely different. It made Russian music really be taken seriously across the world.
Julian, you have chosen a single example of a living composer, an American. Why so?
Because I think he's sort of entered into the public consciousness. His style of music, when people hear it, you can say, that's Philip Glass. I mean, he's a Marmite composer. You either love him or loathe him. I've seen audiences of really young people come to his music. So, exciting composer. He made no money at all, as usual, most composers like this, until a bit later on, and he used to drive a cab around New York. So it's very urban music.
Well, thanks to our guide, Julian Lloyd-Webber, we have rushed through centuries of music from the 12th to the 21st, and somehow it has all been recognisably classical music. I think it's been extremely important to the human race over that period, and to our humanity, in the sense that nothing has better expressed our joy, or our tragedy, or our ethical dilemmas, or our suffering. Nothing has been better at all of that than classical music. And I would ask our quartet now to play us out with, what? Some Mozart.
Well, thank you to Julian Lloyd-Webber, Michael Portillo and to the wonderful musicians from the Purcell School, Luca Newman, Celeste Bolmat, Hannah McDowell, Jessica Hendry, Fiona Chanvin-Chi and Emma Price. Arlene Foster will be here next week. Enjoy the rest of your Easter Sunday. Emily Carver's up next, though. Goodbye from me.
Hello there. Welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office. I'm Jonathan Vautry. Do make the most of any dry weather you have throughout the rest of today, because it is going to be turning more unsettled over the next few days. High pressure is losing its influence across the UK and allowing these weather fronts to start pushing their way in from the Atlantic. A squeeze in the isobars as well means that it will be turning breezier for all of us. But into the evening, these fronts will be bringing rain first to Northern Ireland and then into Western Scotland, where we could see some heavier bursts at times. Gales through the North Channel and up around other coasts of North Scotland as well. Generally for England and Wales, the rain will be patchier throughout the night, and we will then see some clearer spells developing for Northern Ireland and North West Scotland later on, allowing temperatures to drop down here. But underneath the extensive cloud elsewhere, it will be quite a mild start to Monday morning, but also a fairly damp and soggy one as well. This rain could take some time to clear off southeast England as well as in Shetland, maybe into the afternoon before it eventually disperses. Behind that, Monday will be a day of some sunny spells, but also quite